I didn't say a word when he screamed at me in my own kitchen. I just stood there, holding a dish towel, and I thought, this is the man my daughter chose. That was 3 years before everything fell apart. Before the lawyers, before the phone calls at 2 in the morning, before I did the one thing my son-in-law never thought I was capable of doing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Maureen. I'm 67 years old, and I live in a small house in Oakville, Ontario. The same house where I raised my daughter, where I planted the garden out back, where my husband Leonard spent his last years before the cancer took him in 2019. After he passed, the house felt enormous. 4 bedrooms, 2 floors, the old oak tree in the backyard that my daughter used to climb as a girl. Too much house for one woman, that's what everyone said. My daughter's name is Simone. She's 38 now. She was always the kind of person who lit up a room. Quick to laugh. Generous to a fault, the type who remembered everyone's birthday and showed up with food when you were sick. I used to watch her from across the kitchen table and feel something so full in my chest, it almost hurt. I raised that girl on my own after Leonard got sick. I worked 22 years as an office administrator at a law firm in Burlington. I clipped coupons. I drove a used Civic for 11 years. I did everything I could so she could go to university without debt, so she could start her life with something under her feet instead of nothing. See, she met her husband. I'll call him my son-in-law, because even now I struggle to say his name without my jaw going tight. At a work conference in Toronto in 2014, he was charming. I'll give him that. Tall, well-dressed. The kind of man who makes eye contact when he shakes your hand and makes you feel like you're the most interesting person in the room. He worked in commercial real estate, made good money. Simone was dazzled, and I understood why. After 2 difficult relationships in her 20s, she was ready for something that felt solid. They got married in 2016, small ceremony in Niagara-on-the-Lake. I paid for the flowers and the photographer. I helped Simone choose her dress. I stood in the front row and cried the good kind of tears. The first time I noticed something was off, it was small. A comment he made at Christmas dinner that first year. I'd made my tourtière. It's a Quebec meat pie, my mother's recipe. Something I'd been making every December for 30 years. He looked at it, then looked at Simone, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "She's still making that thing?" Simone laughed it off. I laughed it off too. I told myself he was nervous around family. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I kept telling myself those things for a long time. By 2018, Simone and her husband had bought a house in Mississauga, a semi-detached, on a quiet street, good school district. They were talking about children. Simone called me every Sunday and we'd talk for an hour. Those phone calls were the best part of my week. Then the calls started getting shorter. Then they started getting cancelled. Then there were months where I barely heard from her at all, and when I did, she sounded careful, measured, like she was choosing every word. I asked her once, gently, if everything was okay. She said yes. She said her husband was under a lot of pressure at work. She said she was tired. I believed her because I wanted to. The first time he spoke to me the way he did, really spoke to me, was Thanksgiving 2019. Leonard had just died in March of that year. I was still raw in the way grief makes you raw, the kind where you hold it together fine until you don't. I'd driven up to Mississauga with a carload of food. I wanted to contribute. I wanted to feel useful. I walked in the front door and set my bags on the counter, and my son-in-law looked at what I'd brought and said, "We told you. We were doing it catered this year. Simone hadn't told me that, I said, quietly, that I must have misunderstood, he said, in front of Simone, in front of two of his colleagues who were already seated at the dining room table. This is exactly what I mean. She never listens. I felt the color rise in my face. I excused myself to the bathroom and stood at the sink with the water running, and I breathed. Then I came back out, and I sat through that dinner with a smile on my face because Simone was watching me with an expression I didn't know how to name yet. An expression I've since learned to recognize. It was fear, not of me, of what would happen after I left. After Leonard died, I'd been thinking about what to do with the house. My financial advisor, a woman I'd been working with for a decade, someone I trusted completely, had suggested I look at my options. The house was paid off. Leonard had left a small life insurance payout. I had my RRSP, my pension from the law firm, and the proceeds from the sale of the small rental property we'd held for years in Hamilton. I wasn't wealthy by any stretch, but I was stable, careful, the way I'd always been. My son-in-law knew this. He had made it his business to know this. It started with small comments. How it was a shame I was rattling around in that big house alone. How property values in Oakville had gone up. I could sell, simplify, be closer to them. He said it the way he said most things, lightly, like he was just thinking out loud, but he said it repeatedly. Every visit, every phone call where I happened to speak to him instead of Simone. Then in the spring of 2020, during the lockdowns, Simone called me crying. She said her husband's business had taken a hit. Commercial real estate had collapsed overnight. He had a line of credit and a business partner who'd backed out. She said they were worried about the mortgage. I sent them $12,000. I told myself it was a loan. I did not put anything in writing. A year later, they needed another $8,000. For the furnace, Simone said. For some legal issue with the business, her husband said. I sent it. I don't say this to make myself sound foolish. I say it because I know how it works. When you love someone, when your child is frightened, you don't stop to do the math. You just give. I had been giving my whole life. It was the only language I knew for love. By the fall of 2021, my son-in-law had a new idea. He presented it like a business proposal. He actually sat me down in my own living room. They'd come to visit, which was rare by then, and he laid out a plan. He wanted to take out a home equity line of credit on my house. He said the rates were good. He said he had an investment opportunity that would set the whole family up. He said, and I remember this exactly, Maureen, you're not doing anything with this equity. It's just sitting there. I looked at Simone. She was looking at the floor. I said I'd think about it. I did not sleep that night. I lay in Leonard's side of the bed. I still slept on my side, 5 years in, and I looked at the ceiling and I thought about what Leonard would have said. I knew exactly what he would have said. He would have said, "Don't." I told my son-in-law no. He did not take it well. He didn't yell. Not right away. He went quiet in the particular way of men who are used to getting what they want. He stopped calling. When I came to visit, he was elsewhere. When I brought it up with Simone, she changed the subject. Her voice going careful and thin. 6 months later, I found out through a mutual friend that they had taken out a private loan, high interest. Something offshore, structured in a way that made no sense to me when my financial advisor explained it. She was worried. She said, "Maureen, this is not something you want to be attached to." I wasn't attached, but Simone was. The summer of 2022 was hard. I could feel my daughter slipping. She'd gone back to work full-time, was running herself ragged, And when I tried to ask her how she really was, she'd say, "I'm fine, Mum," in a voice that meant she was not fine at all. I suggested she come stay with me for a few weeks. She said her husband needed her home. I suggested we have lunch, just the two of us, like we used to. She said she'd check the schedule. She never checked the schedule. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in the garden, cutting back the hostas before the frost, my phone in my cardigan pocket. It was Simone, and she was crying so hard. I couldn't make out the words for the first 30 seconds. When I finally understood what she was saying, I sat down on the cold ground right there between the flower beds. Her husband had used her signature on a document. A financial document. She'd signed something months ago. She thought it was for his business insurance, and she'd just found out what it actually was. There was a third party involved. There was money owed. And the people who were owed it had started calling the house. I drove to Mississauga that afternoon without even changing out of my gardening clothes. He was there when I arrived. That surprised me. I'd expected him to be elsewhere the way he usually was when things got difficult. But he was sitting at the kitchen table, and he looked at me when I walked in, not with shame, not with guilt, but with something that looked a lot like calculation. I sat across from him. Simone sat beside me. I asked him to explain what had happened. He did not explain. Instead, he said, "This wouldn't be an issue if your mother had helped us when I asked." There are moments in life when you realize that something you told yourself, something you believed completely, something you built around yourself like a structure, is not true. That was one of those moments. I had told myself he was difficult but not cruel. I had told myself he loved my daughter even if he didn't show it well. I had told myself I was imagining things. I looked at Simone and she was not looking at me. She was looking at her hands. I did not raise my voice. I asked him one more time, plainly, to tell me exactly what he'd done and exactly how much was owed. He told me to mind my own business. He told me I'd always interfered. He told me that Simone had been happy before I got involved, which was such a rewrite of reality that for a moment I thought I must have heard wrong. Then he stood up and he pointed at the door and he told me to get out of his house. I got up. I put on my coat. I looked at my daughter and I said, very quietly, "Call me when you're ready." She did not call for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, did not sit still. I called my financial advisor. I called the family lawyer, a man I'd used for Leonard's estate, someone who knew my situation. I wrote down everything I could remember, every conversation, every dollar, every date. I kept a document on my computer and I updated it every night. I also contacted a family law lawyer that a friend recommended, a woman. Sharp. She'd handled several cases involving financial coercion within marriages. She told me that what had happened to Simone, the forged signature, the misrepresented document, was not a civil matter. It was potentially criminal. She asked if Simone would be willing to speak with her. 6 weeks after I walked out of that kitchen, my daughter called. She was at a Tim Hortons 2 blocks from the house. She said she'd told him she was going to get groceries. She was whispering. She said, "Mum, I don't know what to do." I said, "You don't have to know. I'll help you figure it out." What came next was not fast, and it was not simple. I want to be honest about that because I think when people tell these stories, they make it sound like one decision and everything unravels cleanly. It wasn't like that. Simone went back home that night. She went back home the night after that. There were weeks where she pulled away again, where I could feel her retreating, and I had to learn the hardest thing I've ever had to learn. that I could not want her out of that situation more than she wanted it herself. But I kept the lawyer on retainer. I kept updating my document. I kept my phone on, and then in January 2023, something shifted. I don't know exactly what happened. Simone didn't tell me all of it. Even now, she's kept some of it to herself, and I respect that. But she called me on a Friday night, calm in the way that people get calm when they've made a decision they've been circling for a long time. She said she'd spoken to a legal aid lawyer at a women's center in Mississauga. She said she had a plan. I said, "Tell me what you need." She needed a place to stay. She needed someone to drive her when the time came, so there was no car he could track. She needed me to say nothing to anyone, not to mutual friends, not to his family, not to my own sister, who I told everything. She needed me to be exactly where I was and do exactly what she asked. I said yes to all of it on a Wednesday morning in February while her husband was in a meeting downtown. He had started doing consulting work, which kept him downtown until at least noon. Simone left. She had packed a bag the week before and left it in her car. She drove to a friend's house first, then called me. I picked her up and brought her to Oakville. She stood in my front hallway with one bag over her shoulder, and she looked around at the house where she grew up and she said, "I'm sorry, Mum." I said, "Don't you dare apologize." She stayed in her old room. We ate toast and soup that first night because neither of us felt like cooking. We watched a nature documentary on TV, and I held her hand on the couch like she was 7 years old again. She fell asleep before 9. I stayed up until midnight, watching her breathe in the blue light from the television, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Clear, clean purpose. The legal process took most of 2023. I will not walk through all of it because some of it is still private, and some of it is Simone's story to tell, not mine. What I will say is this. The document he had her sign was successfully challenged. There were consequences for him professionally. There is a separation agreement. Simone has her own apartment now, a 1-bedroom in Burlington, 15 minutes from me. She has a therapist she sees every second Tuesday. She has started cooking again. She called me last month to tell me she'd made sourdough from scratch, her first time ever, and she was so proud of herself that she took 6 photos of the loaf and sent them all to me, one at a time. I kept every single photo. As for the money, the $20,000 I gave them over the years, I've made peace with not seeing it again. My financial advisor says I'm still in good shape for retirement. I'm not comfortable. I won't pretend otherwise, but I'm stable. I have the house. I have my pension. I have enough. What I didn't expect, what nobody tells you, is what happens after. After the crisis, after the leaving, after the paperwork and the lawyers and the impossible phone calls at 2 in the morning. There's a quietness that comes, and at first I didn't know what to do with it. I'd spent so long in a state of low-level fear. Fear for Simone, fear for what was happening behind a door I couldn't open, that the absence of it felt almost wrong. Like when you take off a heavy coat you've been wearing so long you forgot it was there. I started going to a grief support group at the community center. Not for Leonard, though some of that was still there, too, but because a woman in my book club mentioned it and said it had helped her through something with her son. I went once thinking I'd feel out of place. I've been going for 14 months. I planted a new section of the garden this past spring. Perennials, mostly, black-eyed Susans, coneflowers, some native grasses along the back fence. Things that come back on their own. I spent a whole Saturday out there in the dirt, and at some point I looked up at the house and I thought, Leonard would have liked this. There's a thing people say, and I know it sounds like a platitude, so bear with me. They say that at the end, you find out who people really are. I used to think that meant you found out who was bad and who was good. I think now it means something more specific. You find out who has the capacity to change and who doesn't. My son-in-law does not. I believe that completely now. That's not anger. I've done enough works on myself to know the difference between anger and clarity. It's just something I know. Simone does. She is changing every day. She is finding her way back to the woman she was before, and also becoming someone I've never met. Someone more careful, more knowing, more solid in herself. I watch her and I feel that full thing in my chest again. The one that almost hurts. I didn't save her. I want to be clear about that. Simone saved herself. I just kept the door open and the light on. And one day, when she was finally ready, she walked through.